This is Chris Morrow at Comic-Con at Home, and I'm at the Tin Fish today, remotely connected. The panel is Inspired, Personal Stories in Graphic Novels. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, would you please introduce yourself and tell us where your home is?
My name is Maia Kobabe, and I live in the Bay Area of California, but I'm calling in from Los Angeles.
Hi, I'm Casey Green, and I'm based in Devon in the southwest of England.
My name is Christian Gill, and I live in New Hampshire, which I like to call White Conda.
So we each talked about our own work. Joel has a book that just came out really recently, Fight. So he has his recent debut. My book came out a year ago, and then Katie's was a couple of years ago, all from Lionforge/Oni Press. So we talked about our most recent works, and then we talked about memoir more in general, writing from memory, trying to reconstruct memories, and then how you talk about identity through memoir was sort of our main themes.
We talked a little bit about process, about like how things have changed, like how people have changed in the reaction to our memoirs, because they're very personal. Mine has a lot to do with sexual abuse and racism and childhood trauma, and how people react to you after the fact that they see that, because they see you and they only see the tip of the iceberg and they don't see what all came under it. And so when people see what comes under it, how do they respond to you? I think with Maya and my book, and Katie's too, people have been very gracious about, like, thank you for telling these kind of stories, because we're dealing with types of things that other people are in a lot of ways suffering by themselves with. And it's good to see other people have these same kind of, it's good to know that you're not alone. And I think that that's what our books do for people out there in the world, is like it tells people that they're not alone.
Artists, we spend loads of time working alone, and particularly to have this opportunity to talk to artists who are working on a different continent, it's just really inspiring to have a conversation, share like Joel said, the differences and the similarities in the way that we've worked, and you always learn something hearing about other people's creative processes.
How does somebody get over the vulnerability of telling their story?
Do you ever get over the vulnerability of telling your story?
That's a challenging question that we all continue to struggle with, even as we publish this work. I don't know, for me, the book that I wrote is Genderqueer, a memoir, and it has a lot of gender identity, sexuality, coming out to family and friends and community. And for me, it was a point where I just reached where the stress of sharing about it and the stress of being misunderstood just reached a perfect balance. And I decided that, for so many years I had chosen not being open about it, and then I was like, you know what, I'm gonna try the other option. I'm gonna try being open about it and see if that feels better. And it does, in my case. So yeah, if you just have to sort of reach that tipping point where I'm like, do I want to share this? And it's scary to make that leap, but I think ultimately worth it. I think we'd all agree that it was worth it.
How about you, Joe? Tell me about your book.
So Fights is about, it's called Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence. And it's my life in terms of, it's about every fight that I got into as a kid. So each chapter is detailing a fight that I got into and what was happening in my life at the time of those fights, because kids don't have a tendency to act out in a vacuum. Like, people aren't born sociopaths or psychopaths. Like, that kid that's acting out has had something happen to them that morning that we don't know about. And so what I was trying to do in Fights was to tell the story of how those things affected me, and to sort of humanize these kids that we tend to think of as throwaway children. Like, you see kids acting out, you see them being violent, and you're just like, oh, you're on your way to prison. When in reality, we don't really see how these kids have we don't really see what happened in the lives of these children. So I was trying to draw a story that actually showed people who didn't have experience with this a window into the lives of these kids, and kids who were actually like this to have a mirror to see that there's a way out. There's a path, and that there are people who, the people who are like you, who have suffered, but also found a way out of the situation, and what tools that I use personally to get out of that, so that people would see that, like, these aren't throwaway kids. We just need empathy and understanding about those children, because their stories are important.
How about you, Katie?
So my book's called Lighter Than My Shadow, and it's a memoir mostly of my childhood and teenage years, and a little bit after that of struggling with eating disorders and then sexual abuse at the hands of a so-called therapist. And yeah, very much like Joel says, it came from a place of wanting people who are experiencing similar journeys to know that they're not on their own. It can feel so isolating. And there are often things that we don't talk about, particularly sexual abuse, because there's so much silence and shame around it. And yeah, for me, it was part of my recovery journey. And I think we touched on this in the panel a bit, was that
Yeah.
the book became part of the process of the journey, and it all gets very complicated.
The writing of the story and the living of the life became so intermeshed that it's like, I think for me especially, writing about gender became a way that I explored gender, which became a way that I expressed it, and it's sort of like it becomes so interwoven that you can't even like pick the two apart.
Do you think because of Comic-Con at Home, it was easier for you guys to have this panel versus having it in person?
I don't know if Katie would have made it out.
I would have loved to, but I don't know if I would have been invited.
We all really want to meet in person now. I'd actually never met either of my fellow panelists before this, and now I'm like, oh, next year, hopefully.
Exactly.
So I'd love for you to give some advice to someone who actually feels like they want to tell their story and maybe how they can start.
I think you have to start, I mean, like this is, condescending, but you have to start at the beginning, right? And I think there are a lot of people in the world who talk about things, who talk about making things and talk about doing things, and then there are people who are doing them. And I think if you are a person who wants to make comics and wants to tell stories, the first step is to actually start doing it. You're going to fail. I failed. I'm sure everybody on this panel has failed at like the process of starting anything, because we're not experts, right? You don't not everybody can make a book and be, Chris Ware immediately when we start drawing comics. We have to actually get to that place where we're really good, right? So you're going to fail, so don't let failure be that thing. So just start and practice, and then get to a place where you have to practice failing. I think that's the best way to do it. So, and to be honest with yourself and I think honesty, when you are honest about the thing that you do, no matter what that is, if you're honest, if you are a chef and you make food that you really are passionate about, or if you are an architect or a house builder and you make houses that you are really passionate about, people feel that when they look at the work. And I think you can't be disingenuous when you do something, especially as personal as this, because the capital T truth is embedded in the passion that you have for any given thing. And I think that's what's the most important part of any project, is having that passion. You can hustle all you want. And we all know people who hustle, and they have no passion, and they can have some success, but it always feels dead. And I think that's what you need to do, is have the passion involved in what you're doing.
I'd like to add to that, especially on the topic of memoir. One of the really interesting things that this brings into focus is the idea of framing your story, because each of these three panelists had a very different kind of framing for their story. Joel is the only one that sort of started at the beginning. His is literally, I was a baby, and then I became, he works his way all the way through a story to becoming a man. And his is the rare story that sort of works that way. His whole story necessitated that broad approach. But Maia and Katie are both these framed moments starting when they're a little bit older, in their teen years, and their story is bookended. It's sort of it's about their entire lives in a way, but it really focuses on a few years that were incredibly fundamental to them coming to this realization about themselves. And for memoir, I think the framing is really, really important, so that you're not starting at the beginning, one day I was born, and then, it would take so long to tell that kind of story. Yeah. It might be missing, you might be really missing the point in some of it. So if you're considering writing or drawing your memoir, or telling your story at all, looking at a way to frame it where really fundamental things are happening to you in a smaller time frame can be really, really helpful both to you to sort of crystallize what you're trying to capture. And it's also a benefit to the reader, I think, to not give them such an unwieldy sack of information to deal with. But I think, you know, each of these people did an amazing job telling their story and sort of picking just the right framing for it. But Joel's was interesting to edit in that way because it was such an expansive story and covered all of these different aspects of his life. But I commend him for really being able to do that and still connect with the message and really connect with the reader. All your stories are so good, you guys.
Thank you, Shawna. I would usually tell people, especially if you've never written or drawn at any length before, just start small. Instead of sitting out being like, I'm going to write a whole book, think I'm going to write a short story, and choose, especially if you're working from memory, choose one memory that stands out really vividly in your mind and think, I'm going to write this, maybe it'll be 5 pages, maybe 10 pages, and just start with one very clear, a memory where you remember what people said, you remember sort of what people looked like, what they're wearing, where it took place, and draw something that's very vivid to start. And then I would, you know, if the story is sort of growing in you, I would guess that after doing that one scene, you'll think of the next scene, and then you'll think of the next scene, and it may kind of grow organically from there. And I think it's easier to approach it in smaller chunks than to set out and be like, I'm going to write the next best-selling memoir, you know what I mean? But focus on something that is really vivid and start there. That's what I would say.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate y'all's time. We miss you, and we'll see you soon at Comic-Con.
Thank you, Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
Have a great day.
Nice to see you
Nice
guys.
to see you all.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice to see you.
San Diego